Oh, sailor, have you found your perfect sea?
In the last two talks that I gave, I spoke about character and then I spoke about ideas, because all ideas that we have come from people, and the kind of characters that have the ideas and the kind of characters that are formed by the ideas form a dialectical relationship. But the fundamental thing I keep saying is it's what happens to the people that have ideas and what they do with their ideas. And it's because of that I want to talk about a certain type, and that's the intellectual, of which I am one, but I'm kind of like a traitor to my class, and that is I'm really dissatisfied with what an intellectual is in today's world. And that's partly because I really love thinking. I love it. I'm not saying I'm that good at it, I'm just saying I love it. But I think in my love for it, I can really see others who don't really love it, but who love to be considered important, who love to have prestige and power, who may even love the sound of their own voice. But they've forgotten the one essential thing, which I think is intrinsic to the development of any set of skills, and that's a very Platonic idea, this idea of you develop a skill, a techne, and in that you transcend yourself, and through your loves you become more, through your diminution of yourself, because you realize how small you are in relation to the thing that you hold in high esteem. That's one reason, for example, I think why when you watch sport you hate the cheat, because the cheat cares more about himself than the sport, and everyone else is watching it. When they see someone do something amazing, it's a celebration of possibility of what we can do through our service to something more than ourselves. And that's exactly the same with thinking. That's exactly the same with philosophy. And I constantly make analogies with music because I'm also a musician, but I love it in music, because I may have said this before, but musicians know where they're at, generally. Of course there's some big heads who think they know more than they do, but if you're any good at music at all, even remotely good, you have a very good sense of how good you are and how much better some other people are. And ultimately that is the same with thinking. And I will say that many intellectuals, many university professors, of which I was one, they love teaching students to learn what it is that they know. But anyone who watches these lectures or talks, I've just decided they will be talks, will quickly realise that, I hope you realise, that what I'm actually wanting to get from you is to develop you to a level where you could teach me something. It's not me teaching you. I don't have a doctrine where I'm moving to get you to just repeat it. Obviously, like in what I just said about transcendence, there's certain things that I think are really important, and it's those things I wish to convey in this series of talks. I think they're really important, but they're not an end to anything. They're just a beginning. It's like the guitar player or the guitar teacher. A good guitar teacher ultimately wants you to be able to jam with him or her in such a way that what you do takes their breath away, because they hadn't thought of doing that. And that's the great thing about being a teacher. But if everything comes down to a doctrine, something that's very easy to learn, convey, and it makes you a know-all, none of that is happening. So what are you missing out on? And the answer to that is every activity, sport, music, falling in love, being good at anything, being an artist, being an actor, that any activity that requires a certain learning, a certain devotion to the craft, a certain diminution of yourself in order to become more, anything like that is a spiritual growth, is a growth in the spirit. And thinking is exactly the same. Now, we think all the time, just as we walk, if we can, except for people who can't walk, obviously, but let's just say, we've got arms and legs, we use them. And while all of us who can walk, not everyone can run a 100-metre sprint in record time. And someone who really wants to be a thinker is taking this capacity that we all have to think and taking it to the highest degree possible, as much as possible. And we all know that there's a number of people, we call them philosophers, but it's not only philosophers, but philosophers especially, but also it's true in the sciences and the poetry, etc. But we know they put more effort into using this part of their anatomy to try and discover certain qualities about it, exhibit certain aspects of it. So that's what I'm wanting us to do, is to enter into that activity where we start to think about thinking. And the intellectuals, a name we give to people who we generally think of people that have devoted their lives to thinking. The problem is, to be an intellectual does not necessarily mean that you've devoted your life at all to thinking. It may be that you certainly like speaking, you like reading books, you like engaging with people, but the actual thinking part of it might be pretty minimal. You might be like, again, I'll give the example of a guitar player. You might be like the guitar player that's learned a couple of tricks and then is able to make a career out of doing the one set of tricks over and over and over again. Well, that's okay, except in the case of the guitar player, they're not doing any damage. So if someone plays infinitely is playing blues scales of the same sort of licks over and over again, that's not hurting anybody. And if they do it well, it can even be enjoyable. And actually some really great players just play blues scales over and over again. But they've got the feel and the sense, etc. But that's different from thinking, in that if you are just repeating the same thoughts over and over again and taking people to the same places with that thinking, which ultimately doesn't help them be more independently minded, then you're not really a lover of the intellect. You're a lover of the self who might be using your intellect to develop that self-love. So that's the polarization I'm suggesting. A kind of self-love versus a loving of using a capacity in order to enhance that capacity, enhance it with others, set up relationships of mutual exploration with each other, so that we as a species can benefit from this activity, from this engagement. If in your thinking you're ultimately doing it so that, I'm hesitating here because there's a couple of aspects to this. You're ultimately doing this so that others will follow you, that you will have influence upon them, because your narrative is ultimately going to show them the way. And in fact, it may be the case that your narrative was really someone else's narrative, was actually someone else's narrative. And this is all ideology is built around this, that someone's ideas are seen as the definitive framework in which the thinking must take place. Marxism is a very good example of that. All thinking must take place in terms of the methodology that Karl Marx had about dialectical materialism, historical materialism, about the ends of what it is to be human, about a communist society, about the elimination of private property. There's a whole lot of things that ultimately all come down to a few very simple ideas. And that dictates the whole process. In fact, if you're not thinking along those lines, you're an enemy. You're a waste of space. You could even be annihilated if you start showing this is just rubbish, that these thoughts are really not only paltry, they're pathetic. They do terrible damage because they are pretty brainless. That's what ideology does. Real thinking, recognizing that you don't know what life is in its completeness, that you're always on the path. It's a quest. We use it in the word questioning. And again, you need to be able to distinguish between a real question and just, I remember when I used to know the people teaching philosophy, and worse than them, a lot of them, this is going back 30 years ago, when analytic philosophy especially of a certain stripe held sway in Australia. And the undergraduate students were unbearable because they used to love nothing more than sitting back and go, what do you mean by X? Or what do you mean by... And they thought that was questioning. Look, that is not really a questioning. You ask serious questions when you've got serious problems. Philosophy that's any good is an attempt to answer serious questions because there is a serious set of problems. And anyone knows that if you've got a serious problem and you want to solve it, then you can't just go and bully and berate people who are asking other questions that might help you solve it. You just think about that for a second, that simple thing in your everyday life. I'm at my wit's end, I've got this real problem. And you might talk to people who give you very different answers. But do you get angry if they give you an answer that doesn't fit your preconceived idea of what the answer is? Which is exactly what people do when it comes to politics. This is exactly what ideologues do. They get angry, they shut down people who come up with things that don't fit their little schema. Well, you can see, that's because they're not interested in asking a serious question. They literally are thoughtless people. And my concern, and the reason I'm talking about intellectuals, is that today, or within modernity I would even say, because in many ways the modern is an intellectual fabrication, an ideational fabrication, not necessarily in a bad way. I'm not using the word intellectual there in a bad way, but in the idea of people like René Descartes, Jean Locke, they're trying to reconstitute or reconceive the world, I should say, trying to reconceive the world through the ideas which they think will give it greater clarity, have greater insight into it. Because the problems they're facing, they believe, whether rightly or wrongly, I think in some ways they've exaggerated their own talents, or just say that. And they've misunderstood the value of myth and story and intimation in life. So I think they put too much upon philosophy, and this is the problem of the modern project, that it is ultimately a philosophical project, and I don't think philosophy is strong enough to sustain a whole world. I've said this before, I'll say it again. I've always found it really interesting that the great work of René Descartes, he didn't see it published in his lifetime, was called The World. That really is indicative of the ambition that he had to do. He wanted to rebuild our understanding of the world, and by rebuilding the understanding of the world, we would redesign the world to conform to a better understanding of the world. What that misses out on, of course, is all this pre-conscious stuff that there's a philosopher called Leibniz. I might have said this before, and look, in these talks I will repeat myself, so there's no way around that. The thing I love about Leibniz is that he recognized that every aspect of consciousness is predicated upon other relay systems of consciousness. So if you take the human organism, it's nothing but a myriad of different sovereigns of consciousness passing off their information. And I think that's, whether you want to put it exactly that way, but I think that's a very good way to look at the subconscious. It's not Freud, it's not Jung, it's not someone coming up with a master narrative. It's simply the way relating where instincts fit into our life, and that instincts are part of the process of how we become conscious. It doesn't mean that if have an intuition about X or Y or Z, that intuition is always right, because certain problems are problems of consciousness at a certain level of consciousness that only can be dealt with at that level. But you've got different layers, if you like, of intellection which you have to draw upon. But the final one is not complete. It's dependent upon all these other things. And so the final one doesn't mean it always knows best. It just doesn't work that way. So that's the problem I've got with philosophy. Okay. That's the problem I've got with trying to place the whole world upon the shoulders of the philosophers. But Descartes, Locke, these are terrifically inventive people. And I, in spite of my disagreements with various aspects of their thought, and indeed, as you can tell, with what I think is the hubris that's driving their thought, I still think that they've made a great contribution to human knowledge, and I don't want to compare them with the intellectuals I'm now talking about in today's world. Because today what we have is a whole lot of people, and I'm one of them, who've made their life on the basis of what they've read and how they've had to go through certain hoops to get accepted as being qualified enough to teach others about what they know. And my concern is this, that many of those people, because of the kind of education system we've had, the kind of economic system we've had, the whole stack of institutional processes and factors have led to this situation where we have a class of people who basically are brokers in ideas for the rest of us, and they sift it, hand it down to us and tell us what to believe. And the diabolical consequence of that is that we have platforms in which some people who know F all, who know so little, think they can tell us what we have to think on every given subject. And the word came out as the science. That was subject science. And that was my subconscious going ahead going. And the way they love to do it is to treat science as some block of stone, monolithic thing that those who do it all know what they're talking about and that they all agree. And it's just moronic. So what you have is the terrible dialectical disaster of people knowing little, thinking they know much, teaching other people to know little, and ultimately what you have is a system of compliance and conformity, all based upon the fact that a capacity and faculty that we need in an incredibly complicated world, because we have made it more complicated, in part through our technologies, but through our various systems of organisation, systems of command, the various codes we draw upon, a whole lot of things have made life extremely complicated. We need independent people, independent-minded people, to be able to converse and dialogue and consider all manner of points of view. But if we believe that everything is of such a crisis, and that it's of such a crisis that if anyone were to say the wrong thing, that the whole world will end, you can just see who benefits from this. And that's another thing you should be thinking of when you're considering ideas. Who's saying the idea? Who benefits from the idea? What is it really doing?
Agenda.
Yeah, is there an agenda? Is there an openness? Do the ideas that are being talked about, are they ones that really open you up? Are they ones that really enhance? I don't believe any of the big ideological ideas of the day. Just take one, critical race theory. It's a particular bugbear of mine. I think it's despicable that people think that it's really good to essentialize race, because then we can even up the system. And Equality is another idea I'm going to talk about. It's a very pernicious idea. This, like many ideas, is something that might be good and true and beautiful in the germ cell of it, but the way it's used becomes very pernicious. One of the things that's come out of critical race theory is this idea that mathematics is a white supremacist idea, that we are being racist in expecting black people to do mathematics in a way that would help them pass the examination. And this is all being done by people who believe in their hearts they're well-meaning, and I don't deny that some of them are well-meaning, but they're brainless. They're just thoughtless. They haven't put two thoughts together. Because if mathematics is a set of operations that we can deploy to have greater insight not only into the structure of the relationships of numbers and the geometrical forms, but also physics, and mathematics is the language of physics, so of the sciences, what we are really suggesting is that one group of people, on the basis of their colour or their race, that they shouldn't have to know this. So what we're really saying, what those people are really saying, is that black people aren't smart enough to be able to learn this. I think that's despicable. I think that, and they don't need to know this, and we can teach them something that would be the equivalent in some way, but a fairy floss version of it, which is complete nonsense, which will not help empower them in any way, shape or form. So it just keeps these people clients. So what you have is the person that benefits from this is the moron who probably knows nothing about mathematics anyway, telling other people they don't need to know mathematics, but they need this person to be the teacher who knows nothing. You can see this is just the ego unbounded, and this is unfortunately what has happened with modern intellectuals. Is a whole class of people with very limited understanding of the world think they know everything that's important about the world that needs to be known, and the one thing they tend to be able to do is use words. So they're people of words, and I know I'm using a lot of words. And it's up to you whether you get it, what I'm talking about, whether I'm just using words or whether I'm touching what I think are very serious issues that can easily be clouded in smoke, and indeed that the ideologue would just try and shut down, rule out that these things aren't important. Now there's another thing. I said you want to look at who's talking to you. What do they know? How much would they know? How many years of study? How many books have they read? And we know, or we should know, for example, there's a Facebook page, I see, and this complete fool puts on Facebook, over such and such read so many books over this period of time. It might be 100 in, it might have read 3 or 4 books a week or something. And that's supposed to be impressive. And then they list the books, and they're all drivel. They're all self-help, be a better person, chant yourself, I am the centre of the universe, all this kind of drivel. And the only thing you ask is, are the books any good? If the books are crap, that person's just waited a considerable period of their life. The idea that every book that's written is somehow the keys to the kingdom, the path to wisdom, make you a better person or something. What kind of deranged idea is that? As if quality does not matter. So, when you look at ideas, or when you hear someone instructing you about ideas, you first of all ask, who is this person? What do they know? How do they know? And in today's world we have all sorts of people wanting to be authorities, from journalists to, as I said, to scientists, some scientists, politicians, a whole actors, celebrities, sports people, God knows, there they are, all these people coming out wanting to tell you what to think because they know everything. And here's another thing. It's not only who's talking to you, what do they know and all that. All of us, when we speak, some of us speak believing what we say. Some of us speak not knowing what we say. That is, believing what we're saying is true, but not knowing what is really true, but saying it anyway. Some of us speak to deceive others. You need to be able to figure that out. But you cannot assume that when someone's speaking to you, that they're speaking from the heart, being good and true. It would be nice if they were. But you know, at the end of the day, if someone lies to you, and you act on behalf of that lie, they've only been able to do that because they've recognised that you're foolish enough to believe them. And this is where we're at in life, is we have to look at ourselves and our own responsibility. Again, we live in a world where the intelligentsia, again, play a big part in this, in wanting to blame all these other people for what our circumstances are. There's always someone to blame. And that's why this whole idea, it's the ruling class, it's the whites, it's the rich, it's the straights, it's the this. There's always someone to blame. You're a damn fool if you're happy to simply go along with that. Now this is not, I'm not just giving you, psychological instruction of what you can do, like, mental gymnastics to deal with the impossible currents of the world. Sure, there are some things that are very difficult to deal with that you may not be able to deal with. I don't think that we can deal with everything. I'm not saying there are not outside forces, but you need to be able to. Some people think they can stop all those outside forces. This is the hubris of the intellectuals. This is what Marx believed he could do. He believed that if you got rid of private property, if you got rid of the division of labour, then you would get rid of all the sorts of conflict which, in his term, took us away from our essential nature. Which is fantastical. And people use abstractions like that. And again, intellectuals especially, the big words they love to use are emancipation, equality, and equity. I saw recently in Facebook, where I spend about 10 minutes a day looking at Facebook, and I've always come away thinking, God, the human race is in serious trouble. And this one was one in which you got 3 coloured people trying to watch a game of something, and it went reality, equality, and equity. And they were of different sizes. So the reality was that none of them could look over the fence, and they were standing on boxes. The second one, equality, was they all had a box that was big enough for them to peer over the top. And the third one, equity, showed that they were actually able to not have any fence between them and them. Now, if you really think that your life is analogous to someone looking over a fence, that's what life is, a spectator sport, you're a damn fool. And whoever dreamt this up is a complete idiot. And someone wrote in the comment section, why don't they just buy a ticket? Which was a far more sensible response than, the thought. This person thinks they're being thoughtful who dreamt this up. They think, but really what they've done is they've set up a set of abstractions that are all led to their solution, which involves, there's no intellectual challenge in the problem or the solution. Now, once governments try to implement these kind of policies, whether it's a policy of, the way to fix up to get rid of crime is to get rid of prisons, for example, that kind of idea is out there. Well, very good luck. You know that's really completely stupid, don't you? I mean, who seriously believes it? But there are people that say it, and they would argue it. And perhaps they're so deluded, they're so bewitched by the ideas that have captured their mind, but they believe it. But it's not serious. You know, they're not serious. That's not a serious thing. And we've seen time and time again, relatively recently, I suppose, with the defund the police movement, some of the very people that were calling for it end up having to need the police and calling for the police because of something that's personally happened to them. Just laughable. If in this complicated world where we need a good grasp of ideas, we educate ourselves to be so brainless that we come up with abstractions that aren't really solutions to anything, but we want to instruct other people within those abstractions, and we get caught up in talking about them, all we're really doing is entering a kind of spiritual death. And that's what I think is the worst thing about so much of the chatter in today's world. It is just empty. It's not a solution. It's not even a problem. It's a pseudo problem with a pseudo solution, which the one thing that's not pseudo is the deployment of economic resources to feed the people that speak this rubbish. So all these teachers, journalists, ideas brokers, many of them in government, they're getting resources. So someone somewhere is doing the hard yards of just, loading up trucks, moving stuff, growing the plants, growing the fruit, the vegetables, bringing cows to market, all of that stuff, so that these people can speak their rubbish and have the resources to keep speaking it every day, instead of going off and doing something more useful like dig a hole or whatever it is they could be doing, or sweep up the streets. They would be doing a much more useful job. And this is because we do live in a society where ideas matter, because of the kind of systems we have, as I said, are ideationally fabricated. They require great intelligence, and trying to bond people together to create a certain social solidarity, that's a very important thing. And that's why we need journalists, why we need lawyers, why we need academics, etc. And if they're any good, they would achieve that. And we know that they're not good today because we live in a world that's tearing itself apart. That's not being achieved. That's the opposite of what's being achieved. And the way in which they would bamboozle you into thinking they're doing a good job is they trot out their little ideas which they think and they argue are so irrefutable. There is racism. There is capitalism. There is inequality. Well, what level are we talking about? To what extent? Of course there is, you moron. Why wouldn't there be? People are people. The question is, what is the scope and scale of it? Have you correctly understood its nature? Have you correctly defined all its boundaries? Do you really understand the damage it does? Or are you being very hyperbolic in the particular features of it that you want to draw attention to? And are you really elevating yourself and your own profession as the kind of fix-it group who should get lots of resources in order to go and fix these problems? Or is it the fact that you really don't know very much? You really haven't bothered to learn very much. You're giving simplistic answers and you want other people to accept those answers because you fervently believe, and you will persecute, denounce, deplatform, do whatever you can to someone who doesn't agree with you. Because at the end of the day, what you don't want to admit is life is tough, buddy. It's suffering. And when we have open hearts and are ready to cooperate, not because we're being forced to it, but we do it out of our own desires. When people from different racial backgrounds fall together, get in love, have barbecues together, do all these things. The shit you're talking about won't happen. But you want to say it's there even when it's not happening. And of course, what you're doing is reproducing it in the most insidious way, as the example I gave of that stupid stuff in the schools in the US about, mathematics being a white supremacist strategy or tactic. So, okay, let's just wrap this up. I know I speak with some passion and lose my cool. Okay. That's because it saddens me that stuff that belongs in a mental home is now mainstream orthodoxy. That our intelligentsia are so poorly intellectually equipped. They must be the worst in history ever. And that's really saying something to some contenders. And look, yeah, they were pretty bad in the 30s. They all bought not all, but so many intellectuals bought the fact that communism was such a great thing and that Joe Stalin was such a great guy. It was quite staggering. So maybe it is that it's just we've got more intellectuals. It's not that the quality is necessarily worse. It's just as we become more and more dependent on them, and there are more, that we have become an increasingly brainless society, and we've got more people willing and greater institutional leverage behind propping up a set of narratives and a set of people who don't know very much. Now, rather than end on something negative, as I said, I'm summing up, but I want to end on a positive point. Character matters. Ideas mean nothing apart from character, but the quality of ideas is really important. But you can only establish the quality of ideas if you're ready to really explore them. And to be really willing to explore them is being ready to dissolve yourself. Okay, everything in our world is about identity. What a shocking thing. If you think about it for 5 seconds, we don't have an identity is a fiction or a fabrication. We're not that stable. Our identity is it's mutable. Everyone, there's not many people who consider themselves to be intellectual who don't in some way, shape or form think that Darwin was right about the theory of evolution. Whether he's completely right or not is another thing, but the good thing about that Darwin is everything is involved in adaptation, and I think that is absolutely true. Whether you're a strict Darwinist or not, I think everyone could agree that adapting to your circumstances is a good quality if you wish to survive. It may be that some circumstances are so diabolical you don't even wish to survive with them. Okay, I get that. That would be a good point. But being able to mutate, adapt, means that you give up. You give up your identity. You are ready to embrace a new identity. And in fact, that's the law of the spirit. If you can't move into the new, if you can't undergo some metamorphosis for something better and higher, more purposeful, because of the opportunities that are given, then you are really doing something that's against life, against your life, against yourself. You so simplify the quality of ideas. We've made it so simplistic that it's just like a catechism. You learn off the answer. Who are the bad people? You say. Who are the good people? Blah blah blah. And now we want movies to reproduce this more, and all of this is just so sad. Instead, wouldn't it be better if, just as someone who wants to learn guitar thinks, I'm going to look at the best guitar players around and I want to be as good as them in my own way, but I don't just want to copy them? Wouldn't it be good if you thought for yourself? Isn't independence of mind a liberating thing? And I think, yeah, it is. And this is, you may not You may not end up the wealthiest person, and that doesn't matter. You may not be the most beautiful person, and that doesn't matter. You may not even be the most morally brilliant person or best person. I don't think that matters. And generally, I don't like moralists because I don't believe them. But if you at least try with the capacities you've had to explore them, and with your own thought, look at what's going on in the world and try to make sense of it, I think you're going to do a damn better job than all those people around you that are trying to tell you you must think this, that, this or that. And if you don't, you are a conspiracy theorist or an enemy of the people. Thank you.